Hi, Haruti.
Hi.
Haruti, you would want to speak so that we're able to ascertain that we are listening you correct?
Yeah, I'm speaking. Wait. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. Hello?
Yes.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay.
We would like you to open your camera. Is that doable for you?
Yeah.
Yes. But it's little blurry.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, this is better. Yes, Shilpa, it's visible. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Mia. I'm calling you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Karima. I'm excited to be here.
You all can open your mic, cameras once, so that we can see how it's appearing. And you can just talk a couple of lines. Hello, Dr. Hina.
Hi. Hi, Karima. How are you? All good?
Yes, all good. So
Good morning.
Good morning.
So am I visible?
Place the camera a little bit towards your left. Yes, it's better.
Fine.
I would request you all to open your cameras. Haruti, I like the flower thing on your head. How was your exam, by the way?
Yeah, it was stressful. Very long.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Aima, you there?
Pardon?
Aima, are you there? Vishal, can you elevate Thaima? Thaima, I can see her as an attendee, but can you elevate her to a panelist? Because she's the moderator. Welcome, Thaima.
Hi, you can hear me now, yeah?
A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to the first session of the second day of SARO's Regional and Youth Forum. Blow hot, blow cold, climate change and its links to young people's sexual and reproductive health rights. Climate change, of course, is one of the pertinent, relevant, and most brimming topics under the current scenario. And in the session, we'll dwell into its already evidence-based linkages with sexual and reproductive health, its negative impact on maternal health, and its impact on gender-based violence and sexually transmitted infections. Having said that, in the session, we would be listening to experiences from a vibrant activist from Netherlands, a young environmentalist from Cook Islands, and rich experience from India. Having said that, I take the opportunity to introduce our esteemed moderator for today's session, that is Ms. Thaima Jadula from Maldives. So Ms. Thaima is working at Society for Health Education, SHE, Maldives, for over 7 years. She initially joined the organization as a counselor and worked for 3 years before moving on to becoming a project coordinator at SHE Maldives. And currently she's working as the program director at the organization. She's a psychology undergraduate, passionate about mental health, gender equity, and environmental sustainability. When she is not occupied with work, she can be found baking cakes and cookies, snorkeling, of course it has to come from Maldives, trying to free dive and failing miserably, or watching Friends. Thank you, Thaima, for joining us. Now I hand over the baton to Thaima. Thaima, please.
Thank you, Garima. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the forum. And I'm so glad to be here, and I hope that this session will be very interesting and informative for you. I'll just introduce the first presenter. She is Mia Nielsen. She is an international project officer within the Danish Family Planning Association international department, and she is currently managing the Women and Earth initiative on behalf of the DFPA, which is an innovative partnership between the DFPA and their long-term regional partner in Asia Pacific region, the Asia Pacific Region Research and Resource Center for Women, ERO, which cuts across thematic sectors and areas of SRHR and gender equality on the one hand and climate and environmental issues on the other. Mia just returned from a road trip around Scotland after having attended the COP26. Her presentation will highlight why we should talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights when we talk about climate change. It will explain how these two are interlinked, show concrete examples of how civil society organizations are working with these interlinkages. But just as importantly, this presentation will also touch upon the importance of involving young people in these discussions. I'll hand it over to you, Mia.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. All right, I think you should be able to see everything now. So thank you so much for having me here today, first of all. My name is Mia, and I go by the pronouns she, her. I'm an international project officer at the Danish Family Planning Association. And what I hope today is that my presentation will shed a light on why it is so important to talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights when we talk about climate change. I have to warn you a bit already now. We have a tendency to use a lot of abbreviations for other words, so I'm probably going to switch a bit between saying sexual and reproductive health and rights and SRHR, but I mean the same. It means the same as well. It's just a shorter term for the other. I'm also going to use probably DFPA for the Danish Family Planning Association and IPPF for International Planned Parenthood Federation. So I hope everything is going to be easier to understand now that I explained that to you as well. So I work for a sexual and reproductive health and rights organization, an organization that is fighting for a world where all people are free to make choices about their sexuality and well-being without ever having to be discriminated. And when I tell people this, they always get a bit confused when I also tell them that a huge part of my job has to do with climate change, because sexual and reproductive health and rights and climate change are not traditionally linked together, but they are very much interlinked. So the climate crisis is not just a crisis for the climate. It's also a gender equality crisis, a health crisis, a human rights crisis, an economic crisis, a humanitarian refugee crisis, and so on and so forth. But today I want to highlight that the climate crisis is also very much a sexual and reproductive health and rights crisis. First, I am very happy to be able to show you a video that we have developed here at the Danish Family Planning Association. The video highlights some of the ways in which sexual and reproductive health and rights are connected to climate change and provides a few examples of how we at DFPA work to integrate the two agendas. So if you'll just bear with me for a small second, then I will show you the video. 2 seconds. Here we go. Yes.
Climate change hits us all, but not in equal ways. It hits poor people harder than rich, vulnerable people harder than powerful, and women harder than men. In East Africa, rising temperatures, extreme droughts and flooding are ruining crops, making life more difficult for many farmers and their families. The need for climate adaptation is urgent. When harvests fail and families' incomes disappear, early and forced marriages increase. In times of crisis, sexual and gender-based violence escalate as well. Because of extreme weather events, destroyed clinics, flooded roads, and lack of access to clean water prevent people from accessing basic health services. This leaves people without access to family planning and treatment for cervical cancer, and causes rises in maternal morbidity and mortality. To achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the global community must address these challenges and interlinkages across sectors. When women and girls face unwanted pregnancies, health complications, and violence, they're held back from attending education and taking part in decision-making, including climate adaptation practices. Access to healthcare, sex education, and the right to decide over one's own body and life are crucial for gaining gender equality. Because women are also key players in adapting for a changing climate. This is, however, often overlooked in programs on sustainable development. To improve resilience, an approach that integrates more sectors is needed. In Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, the Danish Family Planning Association works across sectors to strengthen the unified ability for climate adaptation. Together with WWF, we work closely with districts and local communities to secure access to health services, counseling, and family planning, while supporting alternative livelihoods that thrive in a changing climate and also protect nature. By creating dialogue on equality and rights issues, we spark conversation on norms and gender. We create spaces for men and women to join forces, to access equal information on sex education and sustainable development, improving male engagement and supporting their ability to build resilience together. We cannot stop the flooding or rising temperatures, but by putting sexual and reproductive health and rights on the agenda of climate adaptation, we'll support women and girls in living to their full potential in a changing world. Because empowerment starts with the right to decide.
Yes, that was the small video I wanted to show you. And now I'm going to return back to my presentation. And there we go. Is it the right one you're seeing right now? Does it look right to you?
Yes, it does.
Yes, yeah, perfect.
All right, good. Okay, so now that you've seen the video, you probably also have an idea about, now that you've seen the video, how sexual and reproductive health and rights are interlinked with climate change. At least I hope so. So I want to explain to you a bit how we at the Danish Family Planning Association, who we are and how we work with these interlinkages. So we are an independent Danish human rights civil society organization working in Denmark and globally to promote the right to decide over one's own body and sexuality. The FPA's vision is a world in which sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender equality are acknowledged and respected as fundamental to human well-being and sustainable development. We are, of course, also a proud member of the International Planned Parenthood Federation. So the FPA's international department, as I work in, works mainly in Africa and Southeast Asia, where we implement human rights programs funded by different donors, which also includes the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We work within 5 main themes. One of them is climate change. And we have been addressing the link between sexual and reproductive health and rights and climate change since 2009. And this work has largely been based on global advocacy and programmatic partnerships. And it has been quite a pleasure seeing how much this agenda and this area of work have been developed since we started working with it in 2009. In 2009, we attended COP that year as well, and it felt like we were the only one trying to make this agenda clear about how these 2 areas are interlinked. But I also went to COP this year, and it was a whole other experience. It's quite clear now that we are starting to create a movement that is quite strong. But to dive into our global advocacy work a little bit, It includes, as I also said, advocating in spaces like COP, but it also includes capacity sharing and awareness raising in different formats. This could look like briefs we are developing in the area, or different position papers. We have also at the FPA been a part of the development of, for example, IPPF's position paper on the climate crisis and sexual and reproductive health and rights, which contain a lot of the same points that you also saw in the video before. The video also showed you one example of our programmatic partnerships that work with these interlinkages that is located in East Africa, but we do also have a programmatic partnership in Southeast Asia, which is actually the one I'm going to be focusing on today and in a minute. Because one of the things we have learned throughout the years since 2009, where we started working with this, is that we are truly missing evidence that's a good case stories from the ground where a range of sexual and reproductive health and rights issues are being integrated with climate efforts, thereby improving sustainable development across sectors and driving forward improvement in sexual and reproductive health and rights and climate resilience and adaptation at the same time, instead of the two being addressed in separate interventions and programs. So today I'm happy to highlight a project which is a very good example of how we at the FPA work with these interlinkages and understand these interlinkages. And the project is called WORTH, which is short for the Women and Earth Initiative. So WORTH was created by us, but also our dear long-term partners, the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women.
Yeah.
We wanted to support capacity share.
Mia, I would hate to interject, but we are unable to see your slide.
Yeah. Have you been that all the time?
Yeah.
Oh.
A video was visible, not the slide.
Okay. It's good that you're saying that. Let me just try to fix that really quick. Okay. Can you see it now?
No.
No?
Can you bring it down? Yes. I think it's in PDF. That's why it's creating a little pricey. Now it's fine. Perfect.
Then I can't really see can you see it now? No.
We
No,
could, but
it's
it
not
went
visible.
off.
Yeah, that's because my notes are in the other one. Okay, maybe maybe Garima, you could share share your screen and show my slides instead then.
Okay. It's in PDF. I'll try my best.
Yeah.
It's visible, right?
It is visible, yes. And if you just scroll down.
So this video is done.
Yes.
Where are we? Just tell me where to stop.
Yeah, keep going. Keep going. Oh, that was, yeah. Yep, that one. Can you zoom out just at the top, just below the URL line?
Out.
Yeah, that's good. And then just the top one of the two. Exactly. Thank you so much.
No issues.
Okay.
Yes, let's go ahead.
Okay, so WORTH was created by DFPA and our long-term partners, the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women. And the reason why we created it is because we wanted to support capacity sharing between civil society organizations coming from the SRHR and gender equality sphere on one hand, and the climate and environment organization on the other. And we wanted and we wanted to support the establishment of small local-led projects as well. This meant that Worth was created by civil society and for civil society. And then you can please go to the next slide. So what Worth concretely does is inviting representatives from countries in Southeast Asia who are experiencing devastating consequences from climate change to join an e-course, firstly, to explain sexual and reproductive health and rights, climate change, and the nexus between these. And then 2 learning labs will offer examples of tools they can use and a space for them to capacity share and innovate solutions for the challenges existing in the nexus between SRHR and climate change. The representatives can field test their solutions in between the labs. And after the second lab, they can apply for a small grant through Worth to implement the solutions in the local own contexts. When we select the representatives, we take their ages into consideration because we do encourage young people to apply and be a part of Worth. The solutions they create to address the challenges also ends up being targeted young people and women often, which we of course encourage. And then the next slide. I also wanted to just sum up a bit the best part about administrating a project like Worth, but also the challenging part. And the best part of this project, I think, is that the representatives get to themselves identify the SRHR needs that they find the most relevant and pressing for their context, which actually often leads to the exploration of the full range of SRHR instead of just family planning or contraception. But I also want to highlight and be honest with you about the challenges of administrating these projects that address the interlinked challenges like Worth is, because there are some challenges. And the main one is actually to get the funding we need to keep our projects going, because most funding is still allocated in the silos of either SRHR or climate funding and not across sectors. But the only thing we can do is keep trying and keep educating funds and donors about the matter and the struggle of applying for funds for projects that cross across themes and fields. And the next slides. I just wanted to also dive a bit more into why it's so important that youth should be included, because I mentioned a bit about how we try to include youth in our programs. But I also wanted to give my thoughts on why youth should be included in general in the discussion about the interlinkages between climate change and SRHR. So as I said, I just returned from Scotland after attending COP26, and I must say that some of the most inspiring and strong voices I listened to over there were those of youths, and they are also some of the people across the world that I think are working the hardest to raise the profile of climate change and government agendas. But unfortunately, youth still tend to be viewed as subjects rather than agents of change, and thereby being underrepresented in policymaking processes. This is so disappointing in many ways, but especially because research actually show that increased youth involvement in political decision leads to more sustainable and effective public policy across a range of issues, including climate and environment. But they are also quite simply our future, which interestingly enough is quite strongly shown in their political priorities, since youth in general rate the environment and climate to be a more pressing political issue than adults or older people do. You can, of course, argue whose priorities are the most important, those of the youths or those of the older, but what is inarguably is that it is so important to have representation across ages, genders, social classes, locations, skin colors, and every other characteristic. And since young people are so massively underrepresented in policymaking processes, this argument alone should be strong enough to argue the importance of more young people and their political views and priorities being invited into these rooms where climate decisions are actually made. So I think if you go to the last slide, I think that was where I will end my presentation today, but thank you for listening, and I'm very excited to listen to my fellow panelists' presentations. So thank you.
Thank you, Mia, for a wonderful presentation. And I definitely agree with you that representation should be there, especially young representation when it comes to decision making. We will move on to the next panelist. We'll move on to the questions after all three panelists have presented. So we'll move on to the second panelist, which is Dr. Hannah. She is a humanitarian and disaster risk management professional, leveraging 15 years of experience, including 11 years as a functional head for project management, advocacy, capacity building in the field of emergency preparedness and response in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Kenya. Cutting-edge experience of managing multi-sectoral projects on relief, response, rehabilitation, gender in DRR, psychosocial support in emergencies, SRH in emergencies, health emergency preparedness for response, social development, natural resource management, school safety, education, and WASH in emergencies with organizations like ActionAid, International Committee of the Red Cross, Sphere India, United Nations Population Fund, World Health Education, IPPF, Pragya, and its member agencies. She's presently working with Sphere India as a senior manager programs. Dr. Hannah has earlier worked as a thematic lead, capacity and knowledge management, and has been instrumental in established partnerships and garnered support from government, UN agencies, Sphere member agencies, NGO networks for capacity building and disaster preparedness across India. She is presently the sector coordinator for health and program lead of Sphere India, overarching vertical, namely accountability to affected population, and advocates for protecting the rights of the most vulnerable and marginalized. Dr. Hannah, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Thaima, and thank you so much, Garima. Thanks to IPPF. I'm Dr. Hina, and thanks for such a extensive bio, but I'm happy to be here today and sharing Sphere India's perspective on sexual and reproductive health in disasters, the need that is coming from different disasters that are not so rampant. And I was just taking some stats. This year around, we've had 17 major disasters, and with 9 of them being on the L3, and most of them are attributed to climate change and its implications. First and foremost, I'd like to say that I work as a senior manager programs in Spare India. And for those who don't know about this organization, Spare India is a national coalition of humanitarian agencies working very closely with the government. And we have almost 93 member agencies, which include UN organizations, international organizations, national organizations, public, private sector partners, academic organizations, and government stakeholders who are members of Spare India. We also have 805 associate member agencies. Spare India is a fast-growing institution, well acknowledged for its unique role in coordinating different stakeholders for disaster preparedness, response, risk reduction, climate risk and resilience, developing quality partnerships and accountability standards, effective policy development for capacity building, knowledge management, and nurturing collaborations at various levels. So today, my presentation is going to be more about some of the work that we did between 2012 to 2018, and it's still going on SRH in emergencies and integrating SRH in various health disaster management components of different government programs. And Spare India has provided technical assistance and integrated MISP, which is the minimum initial service package for sexual and reproductive health in disasters in humanitarian situations to improve technical capacity in humanitarian response. There have been successive turnouts, proactive and positive responses from various stakeholders, from government and civil society organizations. This program, which largely talks about SRH in disasters, was rolled out in 16 to 18 states of India, and with integration in 143 district disaster management plans and 8 state plans. So this was a successive feat achieved. We'll be talking more about how this integration happened and what is the status of and what is the linkages between SRH and disasters. So we'll take you some of the slides of the presentation, which give us some indications. I have a humble request that from one of my, I am logged in from two sources. So while one of my source shows a sharing option, but the second from which I'm actually wanting to log in does not show an option. So will Garima or Thaima help me out with flashing the presentation? Or give me hosting rights for my second ID from which I have joined.
So we have two options. We can either elevate you, and I am ready to share the screen if that's okay with you.
Yeah, fine. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
So as I said, next, we will be talking more about, the climate change, giving a perspective on the, overall scenario overview of the SRH and disasters. So if you can move to the next slide, please. I think it's taking time. There are a lot of logos, and these are organizations with whom SPARE is working, and these are all our member agencies. We work as a coalition and as a platform, and try to integrate the SRH needs in disasters. So as I said, we have a field presence in almost 24 states with our interagency group members, which are mini SPAREs working in 24 states. And I have already said that the associate memberships and our member organizations have already given a brief about that. If we can skip the slide. So SPARE India largely works on 4 thematic areas or vertical programs, which is first and foremost interagency coordination, collaborative advocacy, training and capacity building, and with an overarching accountability to affected population, which continues to be our overarching vertical. So as I said, we work very closely with UN agencies, INGOs, NGO networks, and different public-private partners, work very closely with National Disaster Management Authority, and to protect the rights of the people affected by disasters. Here, I'd like to pay a special mention that we have our sector committees as well. Outside of the vertical programs, we are also having sector committees. SRH is primarily taken up in our protection committee and in our health committee. Though SRH continues and protection issues continue to be overarching in all our sector committee. These comprise of organizations who are think tanks at the national level, working on various sectoral expertise. We come out with annual action plans and carve out our way on working on emergency preparedness and response for different sectors like WASH, health, protection, FNS, and so on and so forth. So we briefly take you to, all of us know that the impact of disasters is humongous. And disasters are deeply discriminatory processes that affect women, men, girls, and boys in significantly different ways. Next, if we have a look at If we have a look at the vulnerability profiling, these are some of the stats that will tell you that how disasters, are attributed primarily to the, changing environment and changing climates that have happened over the years, and how much of the land is vulnerable to these disasters, and whether these are floods, droughts, earthquakes. So all of these, have specifically, lead to India is highly vulnerable to different hazards, and a large population in this country lives without access to basic services in normal times, which get worse during humanitarian situations. So more than 75% of the population is affected by disasters every new year, and a lot of above mentioned concerns remain unattended in response by different government, and non-government agencies. As we all know that the impact of natural disasters on reproductive health can be devastating. Communities are suddenly deprived of, we can move to the next slide, Garima. Sorry, I keep on. Yeah. So these are some of the snapshots of disaster locations and some of the SRH concerns, needs, and issues. We have this lady, who is putting up in a displaced camp and she is pregnant. And we also have some of the hygiene concerns of adolescent girls, who come up with their own special needs and which need to be prioritized in disasters. Over the course of few years, we've done some rigorous advocacy with government stakeholders trying to set out, SRH as a very important priority post disasters, which was, post disasters, we could talk a lot about food, we talk a lot about shelter, there are very few people who prioritize SRH needs and concerns. So the subsequent slide also shows a lady being transported in floods, who is about to deliver a baby, and somebody who is already getting a lot of care in these displaced camps. This is a lady who has already delivered a baby. And we still have some other snapshots also, and which also advocate for that SRH needs continue, in fact increase during disasters. Considering the vulnerability to disasters, it becomes far more important to implement preventive and preparedness measures. Most floods occur during monsoon, and hence the accompanying damages such as deaths due to lightning, landslides, house crashes, drowning are commonly reported. Given the vulnerability to frequent floods and other natural disasters, it becomes imperative for the state to increase its capacity on preparedness and response in order to manage the situations during disasters, thereby effectively addressing the specific needs of reproductive health and sexual and gender-based violence. Advocacy and implementation of minimum initial service package is thus invariably a very important initiative in this direction. So if we move to the subsequent slides, we see that there are a set of these are only some of the things that can happen, which are primarily some of the sexual SRH needs and concerns. There's risk of sexual violence, and we've always seen very high stats of these, but most of these are not reported. So HIV, STI transmissions, which increase, especially in high population density areas, lack of family planning, increase the risk associated with unwanted pregnancies, malnutrition and epidemics, increase the risk of pregnancy complications, and so on and so forth. There's also a lack of access to comprehensive emergency obstetric care, which increases the risk of maternal deaths. So we are talking about disaster sites, emergency sites, which have dearth and paucity of basic essential services, and vis-a-vis SRH, and which is how we are looking at this. If we can move to the next slide, Garima, these show some stats of the recorded natural disasters by type. This rings true for India between 94 to 2014. If we see, there's a steep increase and of the number of disasters that we have every year, and which are attributed to climate change. So the next slide, we will run you through some fact sheets on the impact of climate change induced disasters. Over the past 20 years, there's been an average of 340 disasters per year. Floods account for 43% of all disasters during that period. Earthquakes and tsunamis together claim nearly 750,000 lives during that 20-year period. So the next one, 75% of the affected population comprises of women, children, adolescent. 4% of women are pregnant at any given period of time. 15% of them will face life-threatening obstetric complications, and 50% of maternal deaths occur after delivery in the first 24 hours. Shifting further, we are all known that climate change is the shift in global, and there's been a shift in the global and the regional climate patterns. And according to the recent IPCC report 2021, human-induced climate change is a cause of climate extremes, making climate events more frequent and severe. So the rising sea levels, the melting glaciers, the climate extremities have also led to more frequent disasters and humanitarian crisis, severely affecting human settlements. Entrenched inequalities, which Mia was talking about, and socioeconomic vulnerabilities further exacerbate the effects of climate change, leaving the marginalized communities far worse affected by the implications of climate change. Pre-present inequalities hugely impact the resilience of communities and their ability to adapt to this global crisis. Next one, we have some international framework instruments on climate change, first and foremost being the Paris Principles, which is a legally binding international treaty on climate change, adopted by 196 countries in 16, with a goal to limit global warming to preferably less than 1.5 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels. We also have the Sendai Frame for Action, which advocates for the substantial reduction of disaster risks through mitigation, building resilience and effective response and rehabilitation, which was adopted in March 2015. Also talking about the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 agenda for SDG was adopted at the UN Sustainable Development Summit in 2015 with 17 spelled out goals. Now, climate change and SRHR in some these international frameworks that we talked about, primarily their objectives are to highlight that the parties should, while taking action against climate change, consider respective obligations on human rights, the right to health and right to development. While Sendai framework flags the access to SRHR services as important to enhancing resilience and empowering people who are disproportionately affected by disasters, SDGs, on the other hand, there were 13 calls for urgent action to combat climate change and its impact, including through strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity. SDG 3 and 5 speak of SRHR specifically. There are some intersections. The next slide, please. Intersectionality between climate change and sexual and reproductive health and rights is something which is very critical and needs to be prioritized. We are in Aura Protection Sector Committee meetings. There's a lot of debate and discussions going on, intersectionality, on how we set benchmarks for assessments and consider the intersectionality. Now, deeply ingrained systemic discrimination means that women and girls are at a higher risk of harmful effects of climate change, and which can actually impede access to sexual and reproductive health services. Several international studies have also pointed out at the harmful effects of climate change related exposure to bad air quality, heat extremities that risk pregnancy outcomes and have a detrimental effect on maternal health. During humanitarian crises and displacements, there's invariably a heightened risk of gender-based violence and sexual violence as well. So these are some of the cross linkages between, climate change and, the how we bring in the kind of the link and the correlations. Multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination increased by climate change impacts prevent women and girls from realizing their rights and their full and equal participation in society. Why do we talk about rights and why do they matter? Because these health and rights are critical for advancing gender equality and making communities more resilient against climate change and adapting to it. This is what Mia also constantly kept flagging during her presentation. Inequalities and marginalizations are the key factors that make communities more vulnerable to climate change. So our basic response strategies should be to nip the bud, and talk about the root causes of and the root factors and the predisposing factors which lead to it. So next one, the impact of climate change on sexual and reproductive health. Now, reduced or unavailable services in areas which are affected by disasters also have severe implications, and harmful effects on maternal health due to exposure to extreme heat conditions and increased incidence of sexual and gender-based violence in situations of humanitarian crises or displacement. We are also a lot, as I said initially, into developing our own advocacy campaigns on humanitarian advocacy and climate change engagement, which we are taking up with service providers and policymakers from time to time, with a strengthened evidence-based advocacy on linkages between SRHR and climate change. Sexual and reproductive health rights are critical to climate change resilience and must be included in development planning. Enhancing collaborations between actors on climate change, health, and women rights will hold a lot of, will be the key to achieving the effective programming interventions, not only at the national but at the state level. So more and more collaborations, partnerships, coordination would be required. Advocating meaningful participation of civil society on climate change mitigation, climate adaptations, and resilience in alignment with SRHR, where we have also been associated with the SCOP initiative and trying to see how we can again translate it into simpler and break it down into what it means for our country and how we can break it down into achievable targets for the civil society and the government as well. So this, I think we can skip this. This is primarily talking about some of the priority services that need to be in place, which we have advocated, under the MISP wala umbrella. And then we have women and girls are disproportionately disadvantaged, and more than 100 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. 1/4 of these are women and girls aged 15 to 49. And these are the risks are primarily of STIs, unintended, unwanted pregnancies, maternal deaths and illness, and SGBV, of course. And these are the MISP manuals. This was the first one which was developed by interagency. If you can flash the next one, Garima, the left-hand side we see, which was the first manual which was prepared on MISP by the interagency working group, of which WHO was the steering head. I'd also like to inform here that with IPPF support, also tried to develop a global interagency working group and did have a few meetings, I think, in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, on taking up SRH under this, Sathi initiative. So that is like South Asia Together for Humanitarian Imperative, and we did start with some joint actions together to address and develop a joint action plan on how to address the SRH needs in disasters. We can also start discussing and maybe taking revisiting those dialogues, and with a clear linkages with climate change adaptations as well. This is the latest manual which was rolled out, as I said, in 16 to 18 states of India and some other adjacent countries as well. And the outcome is that we've been able to successfully integrate it in some government, disaster management and health policy and plans in different states and at the national level. If we can move to the next one. So for those who are not very clear on this MISP, it is actually includes some equipment supplies. It's a cluster of RH services to meet the minimum requirements in a disaster situation. And it's primarily basically overall all goal of MISP is to kind of reduce mortality and morbidity and disability among populations affected by crises, particularly women and girls. It's a strategy which includes coordination, advocacy on SRH services and planning, and creating, we have created a lot of data bank of young champions, almost 3,000 to 5,000 young champions who've been trained in this under our humanitarian and leadership resilience building academy, which it's a new thing that is kind of the COVID Academy has this transitioning. We are envisioning to train almost 1 million young champions and volunteers from different states in SRH and emergencies, which can be one of the theme and component which we can take up discussions with relevant actors and stakeholders who are working on SRH in the country. And MISP can be implemented without a needs assessment. We don't require a needs assessment since some pre-stat statistics are already available with us. As I said, interagency working group on RH also needs to be activated and do some joint working together and action planning to integrate the components of the preparedness plans in different countries. So if we can shift to the next slide. There's been these impact of climate change on sexual and reproductive health and rights. I think we did go through this. slide, if we can shift to the last one. Spare India as a platform for SRHR and climate change advocacy. With our extensive network of multi-sector organizations and partners, we can play a very crucial role through coordination, knowledge and capacity sharing, collaborative advocacy to bring to light the critical issues such as climate change and its implications on various multi-sectoral dimensions. Advocate with the governments and external stakeholders for recognizing, acknowledging, and incorporating SRHR into climate action plans, and using COVID Academy platform to bring awareness and share experiences and learnings with a wider audience. This has had almost, more than 10 lakh people who have been a part of the COVID Academy, who have attended these sessions right from last year when the pandemic, started in April. So this COVID Academy was set out, and we talk about a whole lot of issues, a whole lot of themes, and this can be a very important medium where we can bring up this strong evidence-based documentation of linkages between climate change and SRHR. So more collaborative partnerships with technically sound organizations who've done a lot of scientific research on the evidence-based research on this, advocating with donor governments and agencies for increasing the funding to support SRHR and climate change interventions, and enhancing collaborations with a range of stakeholders working on climate change, health, and this. I think, I'll just close with this last slide, and which is actually, a lot of it is actually a repetition also, but it's more of talking about, how we can envision it in our own country, interdepartmental coordination in which feedback from all line departments can be sought. I think you're talking about the last slide, Garima, and states have to develop policy guideline for implementing post-disasters. SOPs need to be developed at district level for inclusion of SRH activities in health program implementation plans. Also to keep on record that some of the states like Odisha, Maharashtra did come out with their own, PIPs, which included SRH as a priority, and this was a cross linkage between different departments like health department, a family planning department, the disaster management department, and the women and child development department coming together, putting out funds for this and doing some joint work together on this. Awareness on MISP existing training curriculum for induction of medical officers in public health institutions. So some sessions can be done. MISP arrangements need to be prioritized in post-disaster meetings, and contingency kits to be made available during a rainy season. Disaster management and health needs to integrate this in their respective programs. And again, strengthening the role of the multi-purpose health workers who are there as foot soldiers in the community for referral transportation of pregnant women, and a lot of other actions as well. Prior planning and inclusion of MISP in the health information checklist with well-defined indicators for each disasters. This was tested out in some of the disasters in Odisha, where we came out with very robust and very timely plans which were put in place. I'm so very thankful for giving us some airtime for sharing some of the work that has already happened. But I just want to end and conclude with, 20 years ago, women's health and rights were at best just an afterthought and humanitarian response. Today, the humanitarian actors are doing a better job of providing essential basic services for SRH. But too many programs still fail to provide these basics, and fewer have moved to the basic services to comprehensive. Whether women live or die in a crisis often depends on whether they can access basic services. I'd like to close with these thoughts, and thank you so much for, I hope I have not exceeded my time, Garima and Thaima. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hena. So we'll move on to the last speaker of this session, Ms. Herity File. She is a 17-year-old from the Cook Islands, brought up on the island of Rarotonga, the capital of Cook Islands. She has been an active member of the Cook Islands Family Welfare Association Youth Network for the past 4 years. She is a current member of the Women Deliver Young Leaders program of the Cook Islands National Council of Women in partnership with the Commonwealth Local Government Forum Pacific, which encourages women, including adolescent girls, to take up leadership challenges linked to local government systems and processes. She has experience in journalism, environmental activism, and is passionate about the preservation of Indigenous culture and protection of Indigenous rights. Harity was part of the BBC Project 17, which is a 17-part radio series recorded by young people from around the world on the 17 Sustainable Developmental Goals set by the United Nations. She covered the 14th Sustainable Development Goal, Life Underwater. She believes that one of the most important resources we have is our ocean, and we should treat it with the respect it deserves. I'll hand it over to you, Harity, but just before she begins her presentation, I think we have a short video.
Can I play the video? Can I play the video, Garima?
Yes, Shilpa, go
Yes,
ahead.
go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
For years, the ocean has been what we've lived off, what we've relied on. When the ocean is healthy, our people are healthy. As a Polynesian person, I have a connection to it. Since we first started voyaging across it, it's been the lifeblood of our islands and our culture. But with rising sea levels and pollution, I feel like that history that we've had for thousands of years might end up being lost. This beach is a very significant place to many people who live on the island, and it's a place many families like to come to. It is an experience that is ruined by the amount of unhealthy coral that is here and what that says about the health of our ocean and the health of our lagoon.
Reefs are pretty much our first line of defense. They protect us from storm, big waves during cyclones. They basically dissipate the energy of the wave. If we didn't have this reef here that's been built, we won't have that protection. So all the homes and businesses along the coast, they'll be completely pulverized by the impact of storms. We're seeing a lot of coastal erosion happening on all our islands here in Cook Island, particularly around the Northern Islands, because they're low-lying atolls. We might have to consider relocating to higher areas, so inland more, and abandon the coast.
Specific islands in the northern group are where my family comes from. They lived there before they moved to the main island of Rarotonga. If we were to lose the northern group islands, then all the people there, they would have to find other places to live and they'd have to change their lifestyle completely. And when you lose the land that is home to you, you lose a lot of the culture as well and a lot of your history. I'm not very optimistic for the future of our ocean, and I see that a lot of the behaviors and the attitudes that we are continuing to do or that we have no interest in changing are going to affect the relationship we can have with the ocean. I'd like to see a change in the attitude that people have, in the morals and the values and the way people view the ocean, because once we all begin to respect the ocean and realize how beautiful it is, then we will be able to help it stay healthy for as long as it needs to, which is hopefully forever.
Hi.
Can you guys hear me well?
Yes, we can hear it.
Yes,
Go
we-
ahead.
Cool. Thank you. So, hello falava, malo ilele, pulavinaka, fakatolo faatsu, Maori, hello orketa, taranatato katoto, itera humaria. Greetings and good evening from the Cook Islands. My name is Hideti. I'm 17 years old. For just today, tomorrow's my birthday. And today I'll be talking about the effects climate change has on the Pacific and our sexual reproductive health and rights. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Cool. Can you see my presentation? Yeah, okay, awesome. Slideshow. Okay. First off, to start off, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Pacific, because we're quite a big place, but we're also very small at the same time. So there are about 22 Pacific islands and territories and countries within the Pacific Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean covers 1/3 of the surface of the planet, and we are the largest water mass on the planet. But our land mass is quite small. We consist of a lot of different islands that are very small, very low lying. And I think one of the biggest islands we have is PNG. They're probably one of the biggest, but the rest of us are very, very, very small. We've got small populations, small communities, but it's a really good place to have a home. Our estimated population is about 12.5 million, with the majority in PNG at 9.1 million. And for a lot of us, we live very close to the coast, like within about 1 kilometer of the coast, excluding Papua New Guinea because they have a lot of inland areas, and within 5 kilometers of the coast. So as you can see from the video, I grew up on a volcanic island, which has a lot of mountains and valleys, but that is one of the only islands in my country that has valleys. The rest are all very small and very flat. So they all have like, they're very tiny. So if you can like look at the map, we do tend to have we don't have a lot of land space. We don't have a lot of places to go. And most of our country's territories or zones span over the ocean, and our exclusive economic zone is what makes up the most of our countries. We don't have a lot of land, but we do have a lot of ocean. Historically, our ancestors have lived off and relied on the ocean for a lot. And today, that is certainly the case. We rely on the ocean to provide for us a lot because it's the only thing that surrounds us. We all make a living off of the fish, the pearls, the resources that the ocean provides with us, whether that's in our lagoon or out in the deep sea, and our lives are based around it because that's our main source. That's our main source of living. In certain places when we don't have a lot of land, we will stay on the coast, and in some special cases, we do build out in our lagoon if we can build over coral. But it tends to be we have a very small area to work with and not a lot of land available to expand into other economic sectors, such as agriculture. Like, it's difficult for a lot of us because we don't have the resources or the vegetation or the soil types to sustain any of those like big economic producers. So fishing or things like tourism tend to be what we rely on for our income. Our reliance on the ocean is a very personal thing, and it's been very good for us so far, but it also can be very detrimental to our health because it means that when disasters occur, we don't actually have anywhere to go. There's a lot of impacts that happen when we experience natural disasters naturally, and
with climate change, with the climate crisis, it's become worse for us. The difficulties that we've weathered before with our reefs and our natural protection features are becoming more and more exacerbated as sea levels rise and the frequency of natural disasters begins to increase. When disasters hit the Pacific, they hit us hard. And we don't have anywhere to go when that happens. The isolation of our countries is most apparent during times of disaster. You can see you don't have any neighbors. So when we are in trouble, our access to relief and support is difficult because some islands are only reachable by boats or airdrops. We don't have constant flights in and out. And even then, for the islands that do have airports, it's difficult to get in during times of disaster. Yeah, okay. Our infrastructure is not typically equipped to withstand extreme weather in the best of times. So when disasters happen and they keep occurring one after the other, the damage that we take can be long-term. It can take years for us to fix any of the damages or replace anything. And sometimes we don't even try to, because if we lose structures and places, it costs us more to rebuild it and try to rebuild it and get it back to what it was than it does to just try and find somewhere else to survive. When things like this happen, there's an increased intensity and severity of things like cyclones, tsunamis, and king tides. So in the country in the image, you can see that's Kiribati. They have king tides there, and their geography is very low, and they're already losing a lot of their coast due to the sea levels rising. When king tides happen, it's very hard to find a place where you can go for safety or for shelter. Our security with water and food is also extremely affected in these times because, as I was saying before, we don't have a lot of agriculture, like a lot of mass agriculture to sustain us for a very long time. So when those get affected, when our plantations are flooded, when our trees and crops get wrecked by the weather, then we need to rely on imported food. And even that would be difficult to get into our country because it's very hard to access us as we are not a landlocked country. We are isolated completely in the middle of the ocean, which is fun. So we end up in disasters, we all end up displaced with nowhere to go. And sometimes our shelters are very few and far in between. And then places like that tend to be like overcrowded, and it's hard to like shift your entire family or yourself somewhere that you've never been before, or you don't know what you're going to do there, you don't have your belongings, you just don't know what's going to happen. So there's a lot more pressure on the already limited resources we have, because when we're functioning normally, we don't have our resources to like the fullest capability that other countries would. So when disasters happen, it's very difficult. So things like utilities, electricity, water, education, that is stuff that we're already struggling to maintain to a really good standard. When disasters happen, you can basically forget about it. Another thing that also happens is, since we don't have a lot of land, arguments over land become very heated. It's very hard to find land. And in certain countries like my own, you own the land if you're born here, like if your bloodline's from that land. And so there's lots of like, once everyone's displaced and there's too many of you to fit on one house or one piece of land, people don't know where to go. And it's really hard for us to find other places. In most countries in the Pacific, a lot of people will end up in informal settlements, which are like makeshift things that are thrown together in times of disaster in urban centers. And this ends up exacerbating a lot of the problems we face, because as it is, every day as Pacific Islanders, we're trying to get by. We don't make a lot of money from what we do most of the time. Like, we can't catch enough fish to just by ourselves. We can't plant a lot of taro just by ourselves and sell that and export it. So when that source of income is cut off and what we used to have, we don't have anymore, poverty starts to increase. And with that, like the financial insecurity, the stress, the worry, it's really easy for things like exploitation, especially of young people, young women and girls, and abuse, child abuse. It's very easy for those things to occur because when your focus is more on surviving, getting through the next day, having like just knowing that you will be there tomorrow, it's harder to focus on your actual, like your health and your well-being. That is especially true for your sexual health, because when it comes to disasters, people tend to focus on, oh, well, can you eat? Can you drink? Can you have space? Can you sleep? Shelter? They focus on all those basic things, and sexual health gets forgotten. So things like rape, things like sex work, trafficking, those can tend to increase, and it's a very devastating, it makes a devastating situation worse. In the Pacific, there tends to be limited access to services, sexual health services, because we've got a lot of stigma surrounding sex, surrounding sexual health. So things like contraception, safe abortion care, or even abortion in general, because it's illegal in a lot of countries, and then proper STI and HIV testing and treatment. Those are things that we struggle to get access to daily. In a disaster, it gets completely pushed to the side. It's no one's focus, even though this is the time where it becomes one of the worst problems. When there's also like a decrease in access to safe water during pregnancy and childbirth. So pregnancies become a lot more dangerous for the mother when she's carrying, if she doesn't have the access to the nutrients and the water and the food that she needs to get through her pregnancy. So the rates of stillbirth or even like trying to raise a baby during a disaster, it becomes very difficult. There's definitely an increase in sexual and gender-based violence, especially when you're displaced and you're not at home. There's a general neglect of our health and rights, especially of our marginalized groups. So the people who are part of our community, like the LGBTQIA community, or even immigrants, people who come from like usually other Pacific Islanders to come and stay at a different island country. If you don't have access to proper support from your community, you can get completely forgotten about, and it makes them more at risk for being put in very dangerous situations. There's also an increased risk of contracting things like STIs or getting pregnant easily because you don't have access to the services you need, like contraceptives and proper care. So teenage pregnancy does tend to increase, and then that leads to more worry because you have a baby. How are you going to take care of your baby if you don't have a home? Your family doesn't have a home, you don't have any money, you don't have a way to make money, you don't know what's going to happen. It leads to a lot of stress. So basically, what IPPF has been doing is we've been trying to, what's the best word? Upgrade our infrastructure, like intervene and help prepare ourselves for these disasters because they're becoming more and more frequent. And it's our neighboring country that's experiencing these disasters. Next thing we know, it's us. So we've got a lot of different things that we've put in place to help with all of this. So our humanitarian youth clubs are really good because it gets young people, such as myself, educated about what is proper humanitarian response, how can we help our community, and how can we help ourselves basically in those sorts of situations. As a youth peer educator, our youth peer education networks are also trained in MISP, which is the minimum initial service package for which is like your essentials, what you need when a disaster happens. So for sexual reproductive health, that's for girls, it's like things like period packs or like proper hygiene care kits, like having those things available to you, because when your home's gone and it's washed out to sea, you don't have anything with you but the clothes on your back and hopefully your family. So being trained in MISP and having those products available is really helpful, and it's really good for people to feel have a bit more dignity when they're in situations where they feel like they're helpless and they don't know what to do. A lot of our disaster plans focus on women and marginalized groups in emergencies, because we recognize that, in disasters, when climate change happens, when all these things happen, it's always the people who have more privilege who get focused on first, and marginalized groups can be left to the side. Youth volunteers who are part of our member associations are also part of our advanced response teams. So we work together in collaboration to deal with disasters. We have mobile outreach to displacement camps, which is all the different sites where people go when their home is gone. And we're also working with local governments and national governments to include the minimum initial service package in the health standard operating procedure. Okay, cool. Thank you, and kia manuia.
I think our moderator has dropped out because of network issues in Maldives. So we have a couple of questions. Only 7 minutes are left for the session. So my request would be, I would request the speakers to keep their responses crisp. So I start with a question for Mia. Mia, what were the advocacy tools you used to mainstream sexual and reproductive health under the larger climate change landscape?
Can you repeat that again, Garima?
Yeah, sure. What were the advocacy tools that you used to mainstream sexual and reproductive health under the larger landscape of climate change?
I think that the answer to that would also be primarily what I've been speaking about in my presentation, that we do, of course, engage in all the international advocacy spaces, such as the climate conference COP, where we are, of course, a part of the negotiations, but just as much or even more, we're doing advocacy work in the shape of capacity building and capacity sharing and developing briefs and different position papers to also change the narrative, both of climate change not being interlinked with the SRHR, but also sometimes the narrative being of a different aspect of climate change that maybe is the one that we find the most relevant. So I think awareness raising, negotiations, developing briefs and position papers are kind of the tools that we use when we do this global advocacy work.
Thank you, Mia. That is very descriptive. Thank you again. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Now, the next question is, if there is time, we can go for second round of questions. Right now, I'm going with one question for each speaker. Second question is from Heriti. Heriti, do you feel these COPs, like Conference of Parties under UNFCCC, these international agreements like Paris agreements and all, they have brought some change on your response from your island, or any impact with respect to on your island, Cook Islands?
That's a very interesting one, because I definitely think that conferences such as COP and bringing awareness to environmental issues have helped us as a country politically start to put in place the infrastructure we need to deal with things and raise awareness among our communities about these sorts of issues. But it's hard to put that sort of thing into practice. It's hard to get that infrastructure when we don't have the funds to build that infrastructure, especially on each of our islands. But I have noticed that a lot of our, so the island I live on is not as prone to cyclones and tsunamis or floods or really like extreme disasters as some of the other islands in my country. So like the northern group and certain islands in the southern group. So a lot of the infrastructure there hasn't been updated in years really. But this year we've actually seen like the island councils and the people we're starting to develop what we need to get through these disasters. And it's actually helped a lot. I think that as a planet, really as society, we're starting to look at all these issues and realize this is what's happening and this is how we can do to address it. So I think it's helped.
To proportionately help. Thank you, Hirati, for the response. And now the last question is for Dr. Hina. Dr. Hina, what is the response by healthcare providers with respect to their duties regarding SRH under crisis? We know there is demand generation, but what's the response, like what's the take by healthcare providers with respect to their duties in provisioning SRH services under humanitarian and climate change crisis?
Thank you for posing a very important question, because they are the main, cornerstones of taking this and the drivers of taking this further in terms of the implementation. So from my experience of doing a lot of capacity building of the healthcare service providers, and these are from senior level to intermediate level to grassroots level, we have different field functionaries who are taking care of the healthcare facilities. But I think they've become SRH advocates after a proper capacity building venture, and they've been advocating about it. They've been very open and upfront about the needs and issues and concerns that ail the community, especially post emergencies and disasters. And I think they're quite open to kind of design program interventions and being a part of some of the planned interventions. I see that many organizations and through our sector committees, we did come out with some joint action plans, and try to strategize some program interventions where we have had their participation. So what has also happened is that while we do a lot of capacity building, Mia was saying that yes, advocacy and capacity building are really important. So we kind of impart some skills to these people and sensitize them on the importance of raising these issues. For example, we talk about sexual and reproductive sexual and gender-based violence, right, which is mostly unreported. So during these capacity building ventures, there are many healthcare providers and doctors who openly come out with a lot of cases and a lot of challenges vis-a-vis improper addressing or some logistic constraints or some challenges. So a lot of people are acknowledging that these things are happening, which in itself is also kind of a response from their side, and then also being supportive in terms of lending their support in the program interventions, joint program interventions. And that's it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. There are no further questions. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank everybody for their valuable time and for all the information that you have shared. I have indeed learned a lot, and coming from the Maldives, I have definitely related a lot to all of the presentations here. And I hope that everyone has a good day. And thank you, everyone, especially our speakers, some for waking up so early, staying up late to work with us on this. Thank you, Garima. And I hope everyone learned a lot, and I hope everyone has a good day ahead. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you,